fountain and temple of Pythonis to a friend, and also touches upon the topic of graffiti there. I have adapted the original masculine form multorum to the feminine multarum for my purposes. While in recent decades interest in the lives of Roman women has grown, literary sources and stone inscriptions are still favored over other forms of material evidence, leaving us better informed about elite Roman women than those from other social groups. This focus stems not only from a greater interest in the upper strata of Roman society, but also reflects and perpetuates a bias in favor of these classes in the sources, a fact that has been acknowledged in the exhibition Life of Pompeii and its accompanying catalogue. However, this practice not only favors women from the elite, but also continues to reproduce a male, patriarchal, elite, and at times misogynistic perspective on women in antiquity. Even if texts potentially authored by women, such as epitaphs, do survive, they are often in highly conventional forms, aligning with the dominant, and I would add, patriarchal language of the culture. Women's outlooks, as expressed in their own words, their individual subjectivity, is lacking in almost all of our literary and archaeological sources. It is precisely this individual subjectivity, however, that can be accessed through wall inscriptions, especially graffiti. Pompeii Corelli inscriptions showcase women's active participation. They include writings directed to, as well as those potentially created by them, in the sense of writing as handwriting, the physical act of tracing characters, thereby making these female agents more tangible for us. What is noteworthy is that when women in Pompeii have been discussed, wall inscriptions, especially graffiti, have often been ignored, dismissed, or treated mainly in relation to sexual material. This neglect stems from several interrelated factors, including the scope of the studies, particularly which social groups are examined, and prevailing preconceptions about the material itself, such as assumptions of unreliability or primarily erotic nature, and dominance of quantitative methodologies. I am here just giving some examples and quotations for a quantitative and methodological overview of women in ethnographic sources in Pompeii. I refer to the entry by Patricia Basso and Alfredo 101 in the exhibition catalogue. Michele Davino, in his popular work, adopts the perspective of the Roman elite man and argues that donna honestum are largely absent from the surviving records, as you can see in the quote here. Lisa Savonen, in her great 1997 study, directs her focus primarily towards other inscription types due to graffiti's supposed unreliability. Polly Lohmann underscores women's quantitative underrepresentation, 16% of names overall, roughly 10% of personal names used by individuals to commemorate themselves, and highlights the relatively high visibility in the Lucca map. The possibility that women might have written graffiti themselves has been considered primarily and narrowly in relation to sexual graffiti. Particularly noteworthy in this respect is, of course, Sarah Lynn Richardson's 2019 study, The Brothel of Pompeii, and at this point I would also like to draw attention to Antonio Barone's work on this topic. And it is absolutely important to tell those stories, however, there is something more about. Now, a welcome exception to this trend that either dismisses the evidence based on its low quantities or focuses on erotic graffiti are two articles. One by Alfredo Wolfane from 2009, who comes to the women's rescue, and one by Erika Zimmer-Mandana from 2021. Yet, there is still room to engage with the subject. I won't be able to significantly adjust Loma's numbers upward, but that doesn't really matter. It's not all that discouraging, and the micro-stories offer rich opportunities for qualitative insight. Precisely because the traces are few, they require careful and attentive study to avoid perpetuating marginalization. Now, of course, a problem is that today, less than 10% of the wall inscriptions have survived. Actually, this estimate is from 73 and will be much lower today, and many were neither photographed nor drawn. The older CIL volumes do not offer us the same possibilities as today, where photographs and drawings appear side by side. Although Antonio Barone published all the photographs and drawings that could be found in the archives, an autopsy is impossible in most cases. Consequently, one has to rely on the CIL as a material basis, which means placing trust in the expertise of the editors. This may be less problematic with the volumes of Zangemeister and Mau, especially because comprehensive review volumes concerning these editions have already been published. It is, however, highly problematic problematic in the case of Matteo della Corte's document, which was sharply criticized by Heikki Sevin in his 73 review article, as in many cases fails to meet scientific standards. To this day, the comprehensive review volume remains a desideratum. Only della Corte's edition of the Tituli Picti has been reviewed, which are much less problematic than the graffiti. What follows are some observations based on my engagement with the spoilers. The CILS archive at times contributes to the unmaking of women's history through the arbitrary integration of names into masculina. Many fragmentary texts have been gendered male, a phenomenon that has also been noted by Lohmann and Snowman-Dama. This is not a phenomenon unique to Pompeii. Rachel Helen Banks could observe the same for late antique Greek graffiti, so I'm just showing 2 examples here, but there are actually many more. However, this masculine default is not limited to the integration of fragmentary evidence. We find the same with regard to questions of ownership or agency. Women are only assigned as agency spaces if these are associated with the function of hospitality establishments. Otherwise, they are simply referred to as wife of, even though in some programmata they are named first or individually, such as here. Furthermore, we find certain double standards in the treatment of female and male evidence. There are 3 programmata from Pompeii that show the erasure of the name of the rogator. Where the rogator, Predicinius, is male and bears a nomen gentile, della Corte assumes that its name was erased by its own command. Where the individuals are women, known only by their cognomen, he assumes that the names were erased at the command of the candidate, in order to avoid being linked to these women of low reputation. He interprets the erasure as instances of damnatium in ordine. This narrative has gained support and has persisted for many years. Beyond this, what I call unmaking of history, we also find a specific making of history, which is a sexualized one. Della Corte sometimes reads women into the record as he is assuming a sexual context or content. I don't have time to go into detail here, but you can see 2 of many examples. And to the sexualized history contribute also problematic labeling practices, especially Della Corte's tendency to categorize women almost exclusively as puellae, which leads to their belittlement and eroticization. So he not only uses it for women seemingly offering sexual services or appearing in an amatory context, but also arbitrarily for women identified by a cognomen, especially those of assumed foreign origin and beyond that. This is deeply troubling in scholarship, but especially in a standard work like the CIL, where its authoritative status means that such distortions may have even more far-reaching consequences. By labeling women puellae, through the associated infantilization and sexualization, their perceived agency is limited. Overall, one can say that potential female evidence is not interpreted with as much scrutiny as male evidence, and that preconceptions often take over. I think we need to keep in mind the huge influence Matteo della Corte, also through his other works, especially Casa d'Abitanti, still has on the study of women in Pompeii, even today. Before coming to the graffiti, I want to give an example of his enduring influence, namely Julia Felix and her Custodianis, which we all know very well and already heard about before. She also features prominently in the exhibition, where she is given awards. Much has been written about her, and today, also in the exhibition, she's generally granted more agency than in earlier scholarship, which projected all achievements and forms of agency onto her father. Now, this persistent emphasis on her supposed father, Scuolius, is actually striking. Francesca Generini has already touched upon the topic, but maybe we can go a bit more into detail. The idea that the abbreviation XP stands for the pronoun Scuolius stems from Della Corte. He first put it forth in 1924 in his Juventus. Maiuri followed him in 1951, and Della Corte repeated his piece in his influential Casa d'Abitanti. We find lamentations over how little is known about her father, to name just a few examples. Now, why is this problematic? Because SP most probably does not indicate the father's pronoun, but rather signals that Julia was a freeborn, yet extramarital child, the standard usage of the abbreviation in the first century CE. spurious as a praenomen had always been rare, but from the late Republic and especially in the 1st century CE, it virtually disappeared, most likely because of the semantic development of the abbreviation, probably through confusion of Filia, daughter of Spurius, with Sine Patrifilia, daughter without father. Later, from the misunderstanding of the genitive spuri, without father, there came into being an adjective spurious, which must originally have meant without father and which became the legal term for child of an unmarried woman. It must be noted that there is a graffiti from the Paria, which has been adduced as an argument that Katharina was Julia's sister and that both were daughters of the same father. However, not only is the reading of the graffiti not secure, even if it is right, it is not a counter-argument to the claim that Julia Felix and Katharina might have been extramarital children, since spuri in the sense of uncertain father was sometimes also spelled out in the 1st century CE. So if this is the case, which appears very probable, Julia Felix inherited her nomen Latine from her mother, and no conclusions whatsoever can be drawn about her father, whose praenomen and nomen Latine remain unknown. The point I want to make here is not that it is completely impossible that Julia Felix had a father named Spurius, but rather the automatism with which it was assumed. Despite the well-attested use of the formula in the 1st century CE, scholarship has long attempted to identify the father, a move that ultimately led to diminishing Julia Felix' agency. In fact, Salomon and more recently Dunbar had considered the possibility that Julia Felix is an illegitimate child. However, the prevailing narrative seems to be too strong to be changed. That much on the influence of Della Corte. Let's now turn to graffiti and put them to a different form of withheld agency, authorship. Although in the last years the willingness to accept women as authors of graffiti has grown, not least thanks to the work of Alfredo Buonapane and Sarah Lynn Richardson, potentially female authored texts are still held to much higher standard of proof than male authored ones, to which also William Harris' very pessimistic estimates regarding female literacy have contributed. Amongst others, the contested scholarly history of this graffiti, which we have already seen before, the most elaborate carving from Pompeii, and most probably by a woman for another woman, is emblematic of this. What can be said on the basis of this example and many others is that when potential female wall inscriptions appear elaborate or skillfully executed, female authorship is often called into question. While male graffiti usually require little more than the name of the man as subject, potential female graffiti tend to be assessed using negative criteria such as perceived low complexity, orthography, or the gestures of the writing hand. While in the case of potentially male authored graffiti, it is always assumed that speaker, author, and writer are the same person. This does not apply in the case of women. Of course, assigning here authorship is impossible, but it does not offer any benefit to hold female authorship to stricter standards. Now, you have already seen this before, unfortunately, and there will be some overlap in the interpretation, but I'm also taking the archaeological context into consideration, and I'm actually reaching different conclusions. So maybe, yes. So, this pair of graffiti, most probably created by a woman named Ario, originates from the Casa di Ercole, and more precisely from the west wall of room 13. Here you can see a photo of the context today. I took it 2 days ago. As the house only preserves 4th style wall paintings, the terminus postquem for these graffiti should be around 50 CE. Although the exact spatial relationship between the two graffiti remains uncertain, they were discovered together and they most probably stem from the same hand. Both are clearly legible. CAL 4 is incised in distinct letters into white stucco to the left of the snake, called round the candelabrum. It has occasionally been interpreted as a metrical inscription, though this remains subject to debate. While their readings are secure, interpretation remains challenging, particularly regarding the terms claviaria and the enigmatic exangui. I would like to refer here to Antonio Varoni's comment in his edition Erotica Pompeiana. Today, scholars have not addressed the meaning of the two graffiti in connection with each other. So I will actually skip the general part because we already know about the content. But I have to talk about Plagiaria again because it's important for my Since the graffiti's discovery nearly 2 centuries ago, plagiaria has attracted a wide range of scholarly interpretations. Depending on its assumed etymology, it has varied accordingly. In the feminine form, the term is a unique attestation for this period. Its masculine counterpart, plagiarius, typically appears in legal context, denoting a kidnapper, one guilty of crime and plagi. In the present case, there is little doubt that the intended sense is that of Venus as a capturer. However, one must ask why Arrow would choose such an unusual and seemingly original epithet for Venus. Following Matteo Giganti's etymological proposal, plagiaria may be plausibly derived from plaga, in analogy with formations such as retiarius, rendering Venus literally as spreading out and left to catch. This interpretation is further supported by literary parallels. Also, a certain resonance can be observed with Aphrodite Doloplakos, Aphrodite the Wild Weaver, who appears among others in Sappho's ode to Aphrodite. While I follow Giganti's etymological approach, I diverge from his claim that the term plagiaria must be stripped of all negative connotation and entirely dissociated from its juridical usage. The argument that such a reading would be incompatible with the cult of Venus and Pompeii seems unconvincing. In fact, Antonio Guarino later reinforced the etymological and semantic link between the meanings of the term. In my view, the author of this graffito, Ario, deliberately engages with the polyvalence. Plagiaria evokes literary illusion and legal accusation, capturing the layered complexity of divine agency as experienced and inspired by individuals like Ario in the landscape of Pompeii. In addition, examine research cross-examination. Its interpretation is central to understanding the nature of Ario's relationship with the individual on whose heart she beats. Over the past 2 centuries, both the morphological formation and the semantics have been subject of considerable debate. I don't want to go into detail here, but semantically the reading "he who is of my blood" has led to 2 principal interpretive directions. One suggesting a literal kinship, such as that between mother and son, the other positing a figurative, romantic one. The challenge lies in the fact that external belief in either of these senses is unattested elsewhere. Rudolf Wachter adopts the view that exsanguine represents a variant of exsanguis, interprets the term in a standard adjectival sense, and proposes that it may function here as a personal nickname. I follow Wachter's interpretation and suggest that the graffito reflects the voice of a woman pleading on behalf of someone she deeply cares for, whether bound to her by kinship, it could also be a brother, or by romantic or erotic affection, cannot be solved with certainty. To whom is this plea directed? Certainly not to Venus. The visual composition of the graffiti suggests that Ario did not simply work around and respect the painting motive, but deliberately chose it. The graffiti is visually framed by the snake's head and tail. In the present context, the snake has occasionally been read as a good omen and is almost certainly intended to serve an anthropomorphic function. But maybe we can push this interpretation even a bit further. Considering that the snake here appears alone and reading Boyce, Orpheus, and Jacobello, I found myself wondering whether the snake might here also be interpreted as Genius Loki. This interpretation is supported, among others, by the painting from Herculaneum on display in the month, depicting a large serpent which was explicitly identified in the accompanying Titus Pictus, today vanished, as Genius Loki. Literary sources too refer to the serpent in this capacity. What we can say is that Ario chose the placement of the graffito, or plea, with great care. If we interpret the serpent here as the Genius Loki, a protective deity associated with the space, it is he under whose presence and to whom Ario deliberately inscribed it. Let us conclude with the relationship between the 2 graffiti. I argue that the second graffito, which has either been entirely overlooked or dismissed in passing as another attempt, deserves consideration as part of a meaningful dialogue with the CIL 41410. The choice of the word attempt is telling. Influenced by Zangemeister's early judgment, both graffiti have frequently been read as clumsy or failed efforts at expression. Reading errors into the evidence where none are required is quite typical for scholarship on graffiti, and especially for potential female authored ones. Wachter assumes progeny to be a mistaken form of protolit, yet I argue that progeny should be taken as it stands, a deliberate, self-referential statement. I have brought forth this request. I have given written form to what I have voiced aloud, because on this reading it is not a second attempt, but a retrospective comment. What is particularly compelling is Ario's use of the word profere, which bridges the oral and the written. Ario refers, in the first person, in the perfect tense, to something she has voiced and then fixed in writing. In doing so, she reveals remarkable self-awareness of her own authorship. Profere resonates on at least 3 levels. First, in its basic sense of utterance, Ario possesses the facultas referendi. Second, as an act of presenting or bringing something before someone, a usage common in court, where evidence is brought before the judices. Here, the judex is arguably the genius loci himself. And third, in its literary creative sense, bringing forth, producing, even composing. The juridical connotation resonates with the leading ones of plagiaria. Ario formulates a charge that Venice is plagiaria and presents it before the genius in his role as judge. The very act of committing her words to writing serves to formalize the charge and to add weight and persuasive force to her declaration. By doing so, she renders it more concrete, permanent, and maybe binding. She reifies it. The graffiti are far from a pair of failed attempts, rather they form a carefully conceived composition. Who was Ario and what was her relationship to the house? Another reason why these graffiti are so fascinating is the fact that the cognomen Ario, from Greek areo or arion, is attested in its feminine form only here. Pompeii provides additional examples of names that are attested nowhere else. We know that Ario was a woman solely because she added the pronouns to her name. While we cannot draw secure conclusions about her status based solely on her Greek cognomen, it is reasonable to assume that Ario was a resident of the house. It seems plausible that she, who entrusted her plea to the genius loci, was not merely a guest, but had a closer connection to the place. Scuola has hypothesized that the context may have served ritual purposes only and was also intended for individuals from outside, given its proximity to the street. This may be possible. It has to be remarked, though, that Ario's graffito is the only one from the context. Ario is not the only woman who is fully aware of her authorship and the power of her voice. In fact, hers is part of a mosaic of many female voices. If we look more closely at a number of examples and adopt a qualitative rather than a quantitative approach, it becomes clear that a woman was most likely the author of the longest poetic graffito. That with CIL 4,873, we most probably have the first-person testimony by a typicina. That women, just like men, made use of formulas, such as letter formulas, which are so typical for the Pompeian landscape. We have 3 elaborate female letter graffiti. One is a love letter by Chloe to Alticia, one found on the outer wall of the Capona and thus for everyone to see, shows the skillful subversion of the letter genre by Livia to express her contempt for a man, and in one, the most elaborate letter greeting from Pompeii, Hirtiaxakas uses the letter formula to build a monument for her family on the inner wall of the bottega. Maybe hers? Beyond the use of letter formula, Globe adapts the formula of deficciones for a semi-public curse in a trichinum, and Edone draws on the authority of the edictal form for the advertisement for her taberna. What all of these examples share is that the women's speech is introduced in the third person, adding authority. The power of voice plays an important role. I hope I have shown that if we approach female wall inscriptions with the same seriousness and commitment as male authored ones, we can still uncover a great deal, both about women in Pompeii and about our own preconceptions. Pompeii's high profile, in the sense that it functions as a paradigm of public perception, entails an even greater degree of scholarly responsibility than many other contexts. The image of women that we construct here is disseminated widely. Precisely for this reason, research on women in antiquity should always, but especially in the case of Pompeii, ask not only what to know, but also how we want to know. Thank you.